My name is John Herbst. I run the Eurasia Center here. Actually, not here. I run the Eurasia Center for the Atlantic Council. And it's my pleasure to be with you today. We've got a terrific panel this morning talking about the security challenges facing Ukraine, how Ukraine is doing, and how the United States and Europe, NATO, the EU can help with that challenge. I believe you have the bios of our speakers, so I will not go through them. But Steve Blank has been writing on Eurasia for 40 years with prescience. Ian Brzezinski, a former Deputy Secretary of Defense and longtime actor in especially Eastern Europe. Oh, Michael Carpenter, good. Also a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and worked closely as aide to Vice President Biden. And then Glen Howard from the Jamestown Foundation, who I've known for over 40 years. Now, with that, I will turn over to Steve to define the problem, the overall strategic problem presented by the Kremlin to Ukraine. Steve.
The fundamental challenge to Ukraine is not just to Ukraine. It is to European security and to the international order as a whole. And we have to understand that, because if you follow Russian writing and speech-making about its foreign relations, Russia for 25 years has consistently refused to accept either the de facto independence or territorial integrity of Ukraine. The invasion of Crimea 5 years ago and then of the Donbass are only the most violent manifestations of this. But the fact remains that, as George Vernadsky, the great Russo-American historian, said, that Russian liberalism ends at the border with Ukraine. In other words, what Putin is trying to do, and remember his famous Novorossiya project, is to reconstitute a new version of the Russian Empire, de facto, if not de jure. Furthermore, Russia's refusal to accept the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine is not only confined to Ukraine. Again, if you read what Russian diplomats and officials have been saying since 1991, they don't really believe that any state in Europe east of Germany is either sovereign or independent or therefore fully legitimate. Now, de jure, we have treaties, etc., and relations because they're all based on expediency. But de facto, if Russia has a chance to undermine their sovereignty and integrity, it will take it. We see this in the Balkans, so Ukraine is not alone. It might be the most violent example, but it is by no means alone. What we are facing is a consolidated Russian challenge to the established order in Europe and an attempt to restore a Russian empire. Russia's attempt to restore that empire means repudiation of all the treaties that it signed at the end of the Cold War and after the Soviet Union collapsed. And it utilizes all the elements of what the US military calls the dime, the instruments of power: diplomacy, information, military, and economic. I'm only going to talk about military, but my colleagues throughout the day will be talking about all the other aspects of Russia's war, not just on Ukraine, but on Europe and the West as a whole. We now see that the invasion of Ukraine has utilized all those elements to undermine the Ukrainian government and state, and it encompasses the seizure of energy facilities in the Black Sea right after they took Crimea, the ongoing apparent nuclearization of both Crimea and the entire Black Sea theater. Just yesterday it was reported that Russia is deploying two U-22 M3s, blackjack bombers, supersonic, with weapons. It's a nuclear-capable system with weapons that, according to a member of the Russian Duma, could strike at all of Europe. So once again, Ukraine is fighting Europe's war. It is not an isolated theater of no concern to us. We see as well, in that context, a fundamental modernization of the Russian conventional and nuclear arsenal facing the Black Sea and Ukraine, which I would submit, more than the Baltic, is the most dangerous theater in Europe. 38 tactical battalions have been reinforced in Russia since this started, plus the nuclear modernization, snap exercises, preparation for large-scale war, mobilization drills, etc. In November, in the Kerch Strait, we saw outright piracy. No other word for it. Seizure of Ukrainian ships, the impressment and seizure of Ukrainian sailors, and the unilateral declaration, in spite of international treaties, that these waters are Russian, once again show Russia's contempt for international law, insistence on untrammeled Russian imperial and sovereign rights in this area, and an attempt to undermine the international order by force. And they got away with it. As my colleague Anders Osland, who will be speaking later, said, the response, the sanctions issued on Friday, too little, too late. We need stronger sanctions. We need stronger activity. The fundamental need here, therefore, is for the West, not just for Ukraine, to build a stronger conventional deterrent. Army, Navy, air defense, electronic warfare, cyber capabilities, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, because any of those states is a potential target for Russia. Furthermore, given Russia's ongoing attempts to threaten Europe, and for that matter, the United States, with nuclear weapons, they built 100 of the weapons that we now know to have been instrumental in breaking up the INF Treaty. Not just one or two, 100. And many more capabilities had been announced immediately thereafter, indicating that Russia was planning to break this treaty on a grand scale all along. NATO is therefore going to need to discuss the question of nuclear capabilities in Europe. Whatever the answer may be, that discussion is long overdue, needs to be held. As for Ukraine, Ukraine has to take even more energetic efforts in the defense area to enhance its overall defense capability. And this does not only mean fielding better armies and better weapons. It means reforming the command structure, the defense ministry, Ukro-Bopron, and the Ukrainian political system, as is, we are hoping will take place in the elections that take place in 2 weeks. Ukraine, therefore, has to reform both its socioeconomic resilience and its overall defense and political capabilities. Weapons flows from the United States and Europe to Ukraine probably need to increase, and therefore Ukraine has to reform its defense procedures in order to be able to accept those capabilities and integrate them into its actual defense operations. So, what is at stake in this war is not just Ukrainian security, but the security of Europe and even of the United States. Ultimately, Ukraine, NATO, and the United States, as well as Ukraine and the EU, if we talk economics, need to display greater cohesions among themselves and not undertake efforts such as Nord Stream 2 that will divide Europe. Because what is at stake, as I pointed out, is not just the security of Ukraine, but the security of Europe. Unfortunately, Ukraine is the front line and the most violent manifestation of this war. But there is no doubt that Russia has launched a war upon Europe, and we must respond accordingly. Thank you.
Almost a year now, we've seen a new front emerge in Moscow's war on Ukraine. That has been their harassment of Ukrainian and international shipping in the Sea of Azov. This has led to a drop of shipping from the Ukrainian ports in Donbass, Berdyansk, Mariupol and Donbass and Berdyansk, of minimum 33%, some estimates are as high as 50%, which is a great economic strain on particularly Donbass, but Ukraine overall. And as Steve mentioned, the Kremlin action against Ukrainian ships, use of of Russian military forces openly against Ukraine, an act of war, near the Straits of Kerch in late November. So the naval component of Moscow's war on Ukraine is of new urgency. And we have just a guy to explain it to you, Glen Howard from Jamestown.
Well, the topic that I'm going to talk about today is a little bit of a topic very near and dear to my heart, and something that I've looked a lot at, and it concerns Ukraine and its Navy. And the Kerch Strait clashes that occurred in November 25th of this year certainly signified the growing importance of the Black Sea and the importance of Ukraine for the maritime economy of Ukraine and the developments with its Navy. And that's where I've kind of, with my 5 minutes, basically want to reiterate and kind of review many people have looked at Ukraine from a national security perspective of the war in Donbass. I mean, everyone talks about regaining Crimea and the loss of Crimea, what it means, but also the day-to-day shelling that occurs in Donbass is critically important because it's focused a lot of the country, a lot of international attention on what happened in Donbass. But unfortunately, Ukraine has a very vast seaboard with the Black Sea. And that is very critically important. If you look at the Ukrainian flag, the trident is an important part of Ukraine's national symbol. So Ukraine and the sea are very much a part of Ukraine's future and its past. If you look at in Zaporozhye, anyone visits there, you'll see the Chaikas, and the Chaikas were used by the Kazakhs as a part of their maritime operations against the Ottoman Turks. So throughout Ukraine's history, it's also been very important as part of the maritime component of that. So unfortunately, there's been, with the mentality inside of Ukraine focusing on Donbass, the mentality has led to over-focusing kind of on the ground component of rebuilding the Ukrainian army, and that's very critically important. But the problem with Russia is much larger and bigger than just a land army, and that's been part of the problem inside Ukraine. For 27 years of independence, Ukraine really did not build the national army. And now, since 2014, Ukraine has been rapidly focusing, trying to rebuild, modernize, and to approach becoming a modern army. But unfortunately, many of the senior officers within the Ukrainian military are what they called Soviet mentality. And so these Soviet mentality officers have kind of a ground focus in terms of when they look at Donbass, they look at it from that the only thing that Ukraine needs to focus on is the ground component. Meanwhile, Putin, being a brilliant chess player, has been busy moving in what they call a multi-domain perspective. He has been approaching not just the occupation annexation of Crimea, but he's now been building the land bridge to Crimea through the Kerch Strait. So he's been building the bridge across the Kerch Strait, which was finally constructed in September. Putin drove across the bridge, and it's been, ever since then, it's very highly symbolic. But more important about the bridge is because of the construction of the bridge, which is only 38 meters high, it certainly cuts off and limits the ability of Panamax tankers to be able to go back and forth in the Sea of Azov to help the lifeblood of the Ukrainian Donbass economy, which is exporting steel. And so without the ability to export steel, Donbass economy is going to shrivel up and die because Mariupol depends so much on this. It cannot export the steel by railroad because of limited railroad capacities. So this is kind of basically becoming increasingly a role of what I call the boa constrictor strategy by Russia, where it's very slowly trying to squeeze to death Ukraine and its maritime economy. It's already closed the Sea of Azov. I've become increasingly worried about Odessa and the fate of Odessa because Ukraine has no navy. It lost 80% of its navy in 2014. And it's been very slow to rebuild its navy, and instead has had to depend on the United States and using something called rotational deployments of U.S. Navy in and out of the Black Sea, which due to the Montreux Convention of 1936 limits the ability of the United States to come in and out of the region. So this has really slowly become a more of a pressing issue for the United States, and it's taken on greater urgency since the November 25th clashes, which resulted in the seizure of 2 gunboats by Russia of Ukraine and the seizure of the sailors, which Steve alluded to earlier, now sitting in Lefortovsk prison in Moscow. But what has happened in the short term here is that Ukraine is slowly waking up to the understanding of maritime power and the need to develop a navy. And I would say so much as that the risk of sending the ships through the Kerch Straits on November 25th was actually a kind of reflection of that at least at senior levels of the Ukrainian government, they're now starting to understand the importance of a navy. And now sitting in Baltimore Harbor are several island-class patrol boats, which are destined for Ukraine, and Ukraine has asked for several more of these boats, but it takes time, and it takes time for Ukraine to develop a navy, develop a greater understanding. And so this has taken on greater urgency for Ukraine these days. And so it's, especially since the November 25th clashes in the Kerch Strait, increasingly you're now starting to see at least within the U.S. government and within U.S. military commands, they're now starting to understand the importance and relevance of the Black Sea. They're now thinking about ways to develop a naval strategy and how to operate in the Black Sea, which is a great thing because what the Kerch Strait clashes did last November was it started focusing people's attention on the need for some type of strategy within the Black Sea. A case in point is that recently the United States Navy has, for the first time ever, stood up a whole SEALs unit that has been dedicated to now operate in the Black Sea region. This is the first time ever the U.S. Navy has done this. And so this unit is now on standby to be deployed to the region, and that's very good news because now they're suddenly starting to be able to understand it. But unfortunately, there's been a lot of, as it transpired, within the Black Sea. Odessa depends 25% of Ukraine's GDP comes from the exports of Odessa, highly critical to the Ukrainian economy. People talk a lot about the Sea of Azov, Mariupol. That's another discussion within itself, and I only have 5 minutes. But I would just long and short would say that in order for Ukraine to evolve as a nation, it has to develop kind of a multi-pronged approach to its national security. So it's not just ground forces in Ukraine fighting on a day-to-day basis, but it's also its Air Force, it's also the Navy. And I'd say the Navy has increasingly, they have a vision for where they want to go with their Navy called the Mosquito Fleet Strategy, which is kind of basically developing fast attack boats, which kind of operate in a way, kind of like I call it a rocket Chaikas is what I call it. It's a form of naval warfare that Ukraine is trying to set the trends for. Unfortunately, many in the U.S. Navy continue to look at the Black Sea in terms of big warships and not small boats. So the mentality, even within the U.S. Navy and the U.S. government, and how it approaches the region has to change as well. But again, the key thing in the last several months has been the focus by Ukraine on the need to develop a Navy. Then at the senior leadership of the Ukrainian government with Poroshenko, they now certainly understand this, but they were late in the game in understanding it, and it took them a very long time to try to understand this. And it started in August 1st of 2017. It was when the first cries came from the Minister of National Infrastructure of Ukraine was talking about the closure and the potential closure of the Kerch Straits and what it would mean to the economy of Berdyansk and Mariupol because they depend on this so much. So with this little time, I just want to greatly emphasize the importance of how Ukraine evolves in terms of how it approaches the Black Sea and how it develops a Navy, because there's a lot of ways that the Ukrainian Navy, once it gets the patrol boats from the United States, can interact and operate with the United States Navy in the Black Sea in a way that can help develop and help American capabilities. For example, anti-submarine warfare and things like that are areas where the Ukrainian Navy can eventually one day play a role and help the United States, because in the Black Sea, the Russians developed 6-kilo class submarines that are now moving to the Mediterranean and following American carrier battle groups that are operating in the Mediterranean. And so many of the problems the United States is facing in the Mediterranean with the renewed Russian threat is also coming from Crimea and the annexation of Crimea. So the heart of the problem of the national security issue here is what has Crimea become in terms of how it's affected American national security and its ability to operate for its naval forces in the Mediterranean. On that note, I'll stop. I think I've used up my 5 minutes, but I look forward to any questions and answers.
As we've watched Kremlin aggression grow and become more obvious, NATO, which was very slow to see things, for example, at the September 2014 Wales summit, yes, they established this rapid reaction force in order to reassure our Baltic allies, as if the problem was the psychological state of our Eastern allies as opposed to the geopolitical threat of a looming aggressor. This was fixed in the following 2 years. Decision was taken by the Obama administration in 2015 to put $3.4 billion towards troops in Eastern Europe and Eastern members of NATO. And then the 2016 Warsaw Summit took that as a decision, and we've seen now the deployment of battalions there. So I'd like to give the floor to Ian Brzezinski, a guy who knows NATO very well, knows American interests very well, talk about the NATO dimension of dealing with the Kremlin problem and the aggression against Ukraine. Ian?
I want to thank Nadia for her initiative. She's the force of Ukraine here in Washington, and really proud to be associated with the work she's been doing on these priority recommendations. They're an important product. And John, thank you for leading the National Security Task Force. I was asked to talk about the NATO-Ukraine relationship. And I started from this vantage point when I was thinking about our meeting today. This year marks several important anniversaries when it comes down to NATO enlargement and the impact it's had on European security. It's the 20th anniversary since the first round of enlargement after the end of the Cold War that brought in Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. It's the 15th anniversary from the Big Bang round of enlargement that brought in countries from the Baltics down to the Black Sea. It's the 10th anniversary, Croatia and Albania. And it's also, as was noted today, the 5th anniversary of Russia's seizure of Crimea and its seizure of eastern Ukraine. And what is a lesson from that? Well, NATO enlargement, from my perspective, has been one of Europe's greatest successes in the post-Cold War era. It has strengthened the alliance. It has enhanced the zone of peace and security in Europe. It has benefited both the new members and the old members by ensuring and strengthening their security, which is the basis, of course, for prosperity and the sustainment of our shared values. And that's in such a sharp contrast to the 5th anniversary that Putin was celebrating earlier this week in Crimea, the illegal seizure of territory from a European democracy. And there's a clear lesson from that. And its lesson concerns the ambiguity of NATO's relationship with Ukraine, NATO's hesitancy to embrace Ukraine's transatlantic aspirations, hesitancy to fully embrace Ukraine's desire to join the alliance. I think that hesitancy has kind of created a zone of ambiguity, a gray zone in European security architecture. And that gray zone, relegating Ukraine into that zone, including Georgia and, for that matter, Moldova, has only animated Putin's sense of opportunity to reassert Moscow's control over the zone of the former Soviet Union. It's a destabilizing gray zone. It hurts Ukraine's interests. It hurts the West's security interests. So for this reason, as we approach NATO's 70th anniversary, I think it's high time for the alliance to give Ukraine, Georgia, and any other European state that's seeking membership an unambiguous and clear signal of support to those aspirations, a roadmap, so to speak, toward membership. Maybe it's a membership action plan or a derivative of it, but it's high time that we start chipping away at this gray zone of uncertainty in Europe that's beleaguering the security of Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, and for that matter, NATO allies. It will take time, but it's deserved. I mean, every time I think about NATO and Ukraine, I think about how the fact that Ukraine, in many ways, from the very beginning, started acting as a de facto NATO ally. It sent troops to KFOR, it sent troops to SFOR in the 1990s, it sent troops to Afghanistan, it sent troops to the Iraq training mission, it sent ships to Operation Active Endeavor, a NATO mission in the Mediterranean, to Ocean Shield off the Horn of Africa. And I always remember that Ukraine was the first partner nation to make a force commitment to NATO response force. It was a CBR, a chemical, radiological, nuclear unit. It also has provided strategic lift to the NATO response force. And today, even though it diminished numbers for obvious reasons because of the aggression of Russia, it still has limited troops in Afghanistan and in KFOR. So it's a de facto ally. It's been operating. We ought to treat its, we ought to embrace more readily its transatlantic aspirations. But there's more we can do between now and then, because it will take time for Ukraine to implement a map and attain the consensus necessary in an alliance for membership. What can the NATO do in between now and then, particularly in light of Russia's aggression? I think certainly the alliance as a whole ought to be enhancing and complementing the lethal assistance the United States has been providing Ukraine. That can include air defense capacities, more capable ISR capabilities, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capacities, anti-ship missiles, so Ukraine can better defend its sea space and coastlines. These are some of the things that the West as a whole, the alliance as a whole, should be providing. I think it's also time for the alliance to start deepening and expanding its exercises and operations in Ukraine. I know that the United States had an ISR flight over Ukrainian airspace on the Open Skies Agreement. There's no reason why NATO couldn't do that with some of its AWACS. NATO has a useful set of exercises and training going on in Ukraine. Rapid Trident, for example, is around 2,000 personnel. We ought to increase the size of those exercises, maybe make it full brigade level, demonstrate the alliance's ability to move forces into that region. Just by doing that is a signal of support, and it can facilitate a whole host of other forms of training useful to the Ukrainian military. None of this would be in any way threatening to Russia's territorial integrity. It would certainly serve the West's interests when it comes to deterring further aggression from Russia, and it would contribute to a context that I think would be more conducive to ensuring Russia's withdrawal from occupied Ukrainian territories. Thank you.
Thank you, that was terrific. And now I'll have Mike Carpenter come up and talk about the U.S. side of this problem.
We're 5 years into this war now, and this is a war that was caused by a nation state, a member of the international community, military force to attack its neighbor for no other reason than that it didn't like the internal developments in that country. And it used military force not only to invade, but then it annexed illegally territory of that neighbor and has maintained troops and continues to wage war and kill both civilians and service members almost each and every day in the 5 years that has passed since this conflict began. This is not only vital to the security of Europe, this is about the fundamental rules of the international system, about what we want our world international order to look like going forward into the 21st century. If we don't deal with this now, if we don't try to resolve this conflict on terms that respect those principles, we're going to simply see more of this around the world, and not just from Russia, from other states as well. So that's really the stake here. And we have come at this conflict with such a disproportionate, asymmetric set of interests at stake. We have pretended, as we have demonstrated with the last round of sanctions, in response to the brutal violation, as I think Glen put it, the Steve, act of piracy in the Kerch Strait, we have responded to it with a couple of pathetic sanctions on a few individuals, on a few entities. Let's face it, folks, we have to understand that we are engaged in a bit of a con game here in Washington, imposing what we think are costs on Russia to show the public that we're doing something, but when we know damn well that those costs are inconsequential for the Kremlin, okay? They are not changing anyone's decision-making calculus inside the Kremlin at all. We know it. This is a sham. We have to approach this conflict with a stake and with the interests that we have in the international order because of its significance to that order. So, what should the U.S. be doing? A variety of things. We need to start by imposing serious costs on Russia, okay? And those are not just sanctions, but they include financial sanctions that would really have a bite, that would impose blocking restrictions on all transactions by a select number of Russian banks, so that Russia really feels a financial crunch. We've talked a little bit, Ian alluded to a few of the sort of the weapon systems that are important for Ukraine, given the locus of the fighting and given the sorts of capabilities that Russia is bringing to bear in this conflict. Because, make no mistake, Russia is testing its most advanced military capabilities in the Donbass and in the Sea of Azov and in the Black Sea. Its most advanced weapon systems. It is trying new tactics that it has not tried anywhere else in any other theater of war in Ukraine. And it is using the Ukrainian population and the Ukrainian soldiers fighting in the Donbass as its guinea pigs. And the U.S., both from a self-interested perspective in terms of learning about what these tactics and capabilities are so that we're better prepared to confront them elsewhere around the world, we have an interest in helping Ukraine to learn how to defend and counter these tactics and these military capabilities. So we need to provide Ukraine with anti-ship missiles, both sea-based and ground-based. We need to help Ukraine with electronic warfare capabilities. This is a big part of how Russia is able to prevail and maintain dominance in the Donbass. We need to help with intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance systems, as I think one of the gentlemen here mentioned. Air defense, mobile air defense, not expensive, but initially mobile air defense systems to help provide that cover for a potential Russian air incursion. Because yes, we are right now waiting for the presidential elections in Ukraine, and so is Russia. So is Russia, right? So when these elections are over, Putin will pause and we'll see what he thinks about the candidate who won. If he's not satisfied with who that candidate is, if he doesn't think that that president-elect is pliable enough after the second round, if there's a second round of these elections, he will engage in further military activities. We know that for sure. The only question is the scale and scope, right? So we have to be prepared to provide Ukraine with these capabilities to defend itself and to be prepared for a more significant military incursion from Russia. So among other things, this means, I think, ramping up our training program exponentially in Ukraine. One of the best things that the Obama administration did in response to the conflict was to stand up a military training program with U.S. boots on the ground in Ukraine. In Yavoriv for the conventional land forces and in Berdichev for the special operations forces. Those programs have been a success, but they are small programs geared towards basic skill sets. We need to expand on that, and there's a great interest in doing this. I spoke over a year ago with General Scaparrotti, the commander of U.S. forces in Europe. He was very interested in potentially expanding this program if we devoted the resources and if there was a political nod from this administration to go forward with that. I think that's absolutely necessary. We do need, as I think Ian mentioned, we also need more presence. We need more U.S. military presence on the ground in the seas of the Black Sea especially, to understand what Russia is doing and to help our Ukrainian friends to prepare, to counter, and to provide them with the intelligence that they need to be able to know what's around the corner. Finally, on the diplomatic front, we can't continue to play this kabuki theater of the Normandy format grouping handling the diplomatic track of negotiations. It is time for the United States to simply say, we are launching a new format of negotiations with Russia once we apply serious leverage and pressure on Moscow, and we invite our French and German allies to come together with Ukraine, have a seat at the table, and let's talk about how we can solve this conflict. But so long as we're on the sidelines, so long as we are outsourcing the diplomacy to our Western European allies, who frankly right now have very little interest in dealing with this conflict in a consequential way, we can't hope to see different results from the ones that we're seeing right now. So we need to get in there. I highly admire my friend Kurt Volker, who spoke here before. He's doing a great job. He knows what's necessary to succeed, but he doesn't have the diplomatic backing from his bosses to be able to do that. We have to be in the room. We have to be there together with our French and German allies. And it's simply not acceptable that because of a decision made by the president of France, François Hollande, in Normandy several years ago when he shut Obama out of the room, that we're going to somehow live with that consequence. No, this is a threat to international security, to the principles of the international order. We have a stake in that order. We need to be in the room. I think I'm going to stop there. I could probably go on for another 5 minutes. But let me just wrap up in sum and say what I said at the outset, that we cannot hope to achieve a different outcome if we come at this with such a diminished stake relative to the stake that Russia is investing in this conflict. They are investing billions of dollars worth of money in their military capabilities, in their subversive activities in Ukraine as well. And we are sitting back, hoping that things turn out the way we want, providing a few missiles here, having a few diplomatic démarches here and there, but by and large, taking our eye off the ball. That is not going to work. We have to change that dynamic if we hope to succeed. Thank you.
You're right.
We have a serious advantage, if we want to use it, to stop Kremlin aggression in Ukraine, which will put an end to Kremlin revisionist dreams. That is, Moscow has a weak economy, and it has a population of people that do not want to be fighting a war against their Slavic brothers and sisters in Ukraine. So if we produce the right strong policies, sanctions which will hurt their economy even more, the current sanctions are doing damage, but additional sanctions, and arms to Ukraine that mean Russian casualties if they escalate, Russia will have to pull out. Kerch, as of today, is a victory for Putin because he escalated, he used his forces openly, and he got a slap not even on the wrists, on the pinky. The sanctions that were announced at the end of last week are very weak. I am rarely not the loudest voice in the room criticizing policy, but I'm not going to try and outshout Michael. He got it exactly right, describing the sanctions, how weak they are. They are kind of a sham. We, and Congress has the ability to change that. You've got the DASCA legislation, which is developing. That could be a vehicle for serious sanctions. Sanctions on, for example, Gazprom Bank, of Vneshekonom Bank, which sends a very serious signal. I would add one other thought. I would add personal sanctions that make a difference. I am sure the people in this room could list 50 or 60 Ukrainians who are held unjustly in Moscow, in addition to the 24 sailors. We should name the families of the same number of high Russian officials and say sanctions apply to them. You want to send a message to Moscow, that's a very nice message. Okay, let's have some questions.
We just returned from United Nations. We spent 2 weeks in New York. We met some Russian women, and we heard from them, we are very sorry. And I have a question, because now we listen, you are men, we are women in Ukraine. What we can do together in Ukraine for peaceful process?
The unfortunate fact is that since this is a war, military means have to be brought to bear to thwart Russia's aggression. What you saw yesterday, Putin in Crimea, and what you hear every day from Moscow, makes it clear that Putin, by invading Crimea and Donbass, has essentially gambled the future of his regime on staying there and keeping these territories as part of Russia forever. Because realistically, there's no way Putin can leave Crimea and Donbass and stay in power. And I think people have to understand that, which means that we are going to have to use equivalent means, as John and Mike have suggested, to force the Russians to retreat from Ukraine, which means arms to Ukraine in larger numbers, enhanced training of Ukraine, accelerated Ukrainian reform, and greater sanctions on Russia that really mean something, because Russia will otherwise not negotiate at all. So this is perhaps a discouraging message, but the fact of the matter is that the future of the Russian regime is now tied up with staying in Crimea. And therefore, Putin cannot turn around and get on the radio and television and say to people, oops, we made a mistake. Crimea is not ours. Krim nie nash. It's not going to happen under Mr. Putin, and I think we have to understand that.
Let me just add an additional point on that, and this is building on the points that my colleagues have made on whether or not the West is leveraging their full capacities. If you look at the economic balance between Russia and the West, we're talking about Russia, which has about a $1.5 trillion economy. And here in the United States, we have a $20 trillion economy, and the EU is roughly $19, $20 trillion. So it's a 40-to-1 ratio that we have. How is it that with that kind of economic leverage, not to mention Russia's dependency on the European market from a majority of its exports, particularly in the energy sector, oil and gas. How is it that we're not able to really body slam the Russian economy? I completely agree with my colleagues that what we've had is a set of pinprick sanctions, symbolic sanctions. And it reflects kind of a bipartisan failure here in the United States and a transatlantic failure in terms of adhering to a strategy of incrementalism. When the Russians invaded Crimea, invaded Donbass, the United States responded by moving a handful of aircraft, and a few weeks later, if not months later, a company or two. No West European counterpart action to that. That's a symbolic movement of force, and it was noted by the Russians as symbolic. Our sanctions have all been pinprick sanctions, as I said, individuals. This last set of sanctions against the Russians for their criminality on the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea are attacking a bunch of munchkins who probably never going to travel to the West anyway. It's symbolic. It doesn't have an impact, and it resonates. And what does this communicate to Putin? It communicates hesitancy, a lack of unity, certainly a lack of commitment to Ukraine, and maybe even intimidation to Russian aggression. And so therefore, we really do need, if we want to change the situation or the context of these negotiations, if you want the negotiations that we have with the Russians to actually have impact, to actually communicate to the Russians that they need to move out, we need to use the full leverage of Western capacity. And that means, of course, providing more equipment to the Ukrainians. It means moving forces in and out of Ukraine to create kind of ambiguity and uncertainty for Russian strategic planners. You don't have to have an Article 5 to do that. You just move a brigade, do an exercise, and move out. The Russians got to figure out, what does that mean? Does it mean they'll be there or not? That adds its complexity. And then body slam the economy. How is it that last year there was a Russian LNG tank or an LNG tanker in Boston Harbor with Russian gas? That to me is a sign the sanctions are not working. Luke Oil had a record year of profits last year. We're not having an impact. Until we move to sectoral sanctions, I don't think we're going to change the game, the chessboard in any way that's going to cause Putin to pull back. Until we leverage our economic and military capacities to the extent that we can, it doesn't even require that much sacrifice on the part of the West. We won't change the way. The potential's there. I get worried about the will.
We're talking about stronger financial sections. Can somebody in the panel explain what or who is holding off on banning Russia from the SWIFT banking system? Every month we wait, we give time Russia to prepare for such an eventuality.
I happen to think that the notion that we could cut Russia off from the SWIFT system is actually, I think it's a misnomer. It's a straw man argument. Look, what we want to do is we want to apply crushing economic pressure on Russia, but we don't want it to default on all its loans to its Western creditors. So we want to crater its economy, but we don't want the whole thing to explode. SWIFT is impractical. What is practical is what I've outlined before, imposing full blocking sanctions. In other words, a complete ban on all transactions that touch the U.S. financial system for major Russian financial institutions. And the U.S. can do this unilaterally. We don't need our European partners to do this because we're talking about the U.S. financial system. So as opposed to sanctions in the defense sector or in the energy sector or in the high-tech sector or any other sector of the economy, finance is an area where the U.S. can act alone and have an immediate disproportionate impact. And furthermore, I don't recommend immediately sanctioning all Russian banks from day one. Again, I think that would blow up the Russian economy in a way that Russia would default on all its loans to its Western creditors. Let's start with at least one of the top 20 Russian banks. And what I have proposed is to proceed iteratively, incrementally, with a bank sanctioned every, say, 3 months or 6 months, pick your time interval, with full blocking sanctions and moving up a list from, say, the 20th largest bank all the way till you get to Spare Bank at number 1. And with each move, you telegraph to the Kremlin that you're serious, that you're going to pursue this course, and that there are extreme consequences. Frankly, I think you'd only have to sanction 2 or 3 before the Kremlin got the message and financial markets went into a panic. So SWIFT, to me, is this straw man argument. It's like the nuclear war of financial sanctions. We don't have to talk about that nuclear option. We can talk about very strong intermediate options that apply leverage. Because SWIFT, I'm not sure you get leverage with that. I'm not sure you get any leverage with that. If you completely decouple Russia from the international economy, then where's the leverage?
Many of the speakers today have talked about how the sanctions have been so far very ineffective. You've called them a sham. Under Secretary of State George Kent, who many of you appeared with yesterday, also voiced exasperation about how weak they were. In Ukraine, it often seems that the help that Ukraine has received from this administration has been despite the president, not because of him. Do you think that there is the political will in both the houses, above us, to actually give Ukraine what it needs?
Right now, again, the reaction to Kerch has been completely inadequate. And I think Michael hit it exactly right, describing how weak it is and how dangerous that is. But you already have Congress working on legislation, going back to the problems of the Helsinki summit, the reaction to that. And I think there's a reasonable chance that DASCA is going to go forward this year. But let me mention one other point. The whole question of Russia is a political question in the United States, an internal political question as well as a foreign policy problem. And that internal political question makes it, on one hand, easier, on the other hand, more difficult to get the right sanctions we want in place. I think others on the panel may want to jump in after I've said that.
I don't think the problem is Congress. Congress, as John said, has been very good, and there's a great deal of anti-Russian sentiment in Congress, not just because of Ukraine, but because of their own behavior in our elections and in our politics. What is needed, however, is to focus that anti-Russian animus in a constructive direction, and that's what's not there because the White House is not leading on this issue. The Pentagon and State Department have been pretty good, but again, the policy initiative has to come from the White House. So the issue is not these two bodies, the House and the Senate. It's further up Pennsylvania Avenue.